Ladies and gents, welcome back with our healthcare in Canada running, well, not so well these days. We've been finding out some new information here and there. Bill 36 is a thing that came out of nowhere in British Colombia. And if you think that's not coming to the other provinces, well, you have something else coming for you. But today, to talk about some of the issues with nurses that were terminated for refusing a particular medical intervention, I have with me Corinne Mori. Thank you for joining me. Corinne, you're a nurse in British Columbia and you have been terminated. Can you let us know your story? What happened?
Yeah, I was one of the frontline nurses working all through the pandemic, along with many of my other coworkers. Many of us were terminated because of non-compliance with the vaccination. And as we have progressed over the last year, there's been a few things that we've uncovered in that process, which really was a deeper layer to the story than just COVID and vaccinations. It has a lot to do with sort of intentional decisions by our government, the players that were involved. And as we have sort of navigated through this last year and trying to obtain protection and representation from our union, there were many things that we kind of uncovered. So I don't know if people are aware, but in Canada, there's rules around unionized employees having to be compelled to be a union member. In other countries, such as Australia, the States, Europe, union membership is optional. In Canada, it is not. If you are in a sector that requires you to be in a union, it is mandatory. So once you become a union member, you cannot represent yourself in any kind of employment issues. It has to be the union that does it for you. So it is their legal obligation to represent you. Now, what ends up happening is there's something called a collective agreement, which are basically the rules of play that employers and employees have to abide by. It's the rules of the game. So when the termination started, this was in direct violation of the rules of our game.
Right.
And so the union was supposed to, and the process that they use is that they're supposed to file grievances, and then this goes to the employer to review. And if that doesn't happen, then they have to get an arbitrator involved.
So the whole point of the union itself is to stand up for your rights as an employee in your position. Now, for a lot of people, people were taken back by the whole concept of nurses not wanting to have any medical intervention. I mean, especially in the case that nurses would know best what's good for their bodies and what they would want to have in their bodies, and this is a big piece of contention for a lot of Canadians out there, where the government has come in and said, well, no, it's not your body, your choice. You have to do this, and it'll also be a term of your employment, and it's stepping way above the fray here, and now unions, which the whole point of them is to stand up for you, is not doing that.
Well, yes, and it was just recently in 2019 that our union filed what's called an IWAD, which is an industrial-wide application dispute. So this was in relation to that there was a policy that used to be that if you did not get the influenza vaccination, then as a nurse, you were required to wear a mask for the 6 months of the duration of the flu season. So Ontario, the nurses union, they went to arbitration twice. And both times, both arbitrators said that there was absolutely no scientific evidence that the influenza vaccination was effective. And there was definite proof that masks were not effective for reducing transmission. They have a very short-lived time span. As a result, the BC Nurses Union also took that to Bonnie Henry and the Ministry of Health and the employers. And in 2019, that policy was overturned for us as well. And the policy was that no nurse could be disciplined for not getting the influenza vaccination or not wearing a mask during that season.
Oh, wow.
That became the rules that we were supposed to play by. So when this started coming down, that this mandate was happening, we fully expected that our union would step up for us because this had just been decided, and they had used recent scientific evidence to justify that position, and we won it. So then when it looked like there was nothing happening, we couldn't understand why there was such a lack of response. After the fact, this is what we discovered, was when the mandate started coming down in September of last year, the president of our union resigned, the vice president went on medical leave, the CEO that had been hired for bargaining, he also went on leave. Regional reps went on stress leave. And so we discovered that the 4 months that the terminations were very active, there was actually nobody in that union building. There was nobody doing anything to protect us. They had all left. And we didn't know this until much later. So time is progressing. More and more people are getting terminated because as people were coming back from leaves, they were getting terminated. I did a Freedom of Information request, and up until June 30th, there was over, just in 4 health authorities that I got the results for, there was over 20,000 COVID sick calls by double vaccinated nurses in the healthcare system. So we already were very aware that the vaccine didn't work, and all of us nurses who had been terminated all had been working safely during the whole pandemic with proper PPE. And so, you know, we were.
That's the thing about this whole concept is the frontline workers. I remember as a mechanic having the bumper stickers, "I stand with the frontline workers," and they'd have their masks all strewn around the car that I had to get in, but they stood behind the front, not thinking I was a frontline worker as well, but everybody lending their support to nurses and all of this. But then as soon as there was so much vitriol when it came to people who decided not to take this intervention, they just switched. They flipped on everybody. The nurses were just left out in the cold. And I believe it's like over 2,000 nurses in British Columbia that were terminated. Is that correct?
I've actually just sent out another Freedom of Information request because I want total numbers up until December 31st. But we're looking at, there was at least 2,000 that were terminated, and as well, there were thousands that took early retirement. So our numbers are showing that there's at least 6,000 less nurses in the system than there were a year ago. Now, what we've got happening now is, because we still haven't been terminated, and yet Alberta has rescinded their mandates. Saskatchewan didn't have them on a provincial level, or Manitoba. Right now, we are short nurses. And as a result, now you have agency, which is nurses that are coming from private companies that are being brought in to fill in those roles. Now, the cost of an agency nurse is about 4 times what an employed nurse is. They make more wages. The government has to pay for their accommodation, their travel, per diem for food. It's very expensive. Our nurses now, and I'm part of a group of 130 that have retained an employment lawyer. I have many of our nurses who are currently working in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick. They're the travel nurses making $90 an hour, getting their accommodation paid. And it's like, where is the intelligence in this? That our nurses who are investing in our communities here, who have families, who are paying taxes here, are not allowed to work in this province. And yet we're now, today, there was just an announcement with our union president and the NDP government that they're going to start bringing in more internationally trained nurses. Now, okay, you know, that's an option, but you need to realize that internationally trained nurses are not Canadian trained, and English is usually a second language. The systems and the standards that we practice by here are quite high. And to think that you are going to bring in the same level of expertise into the system is just not realistic. And so right now in this province, we have qualified, educated, highly experienced people who are not allowed to practice in this province.
And they're being tied
Now,
up by
what
the
we just
unions
showed
here, if I can understand this correctly. Like the unions, you're not allowed to file a grievance with your employer. You have to file your grievance with the union. But if the union's doing nothing, well, then there's no grievance being filed. So it looks like you just walked off the job. I mean, for all intents and purposes, there's nothing happening
Well,
there.
the union seems to like to pretend that we don't exist. And so this was going on for months where they weren't talking about us publicly. They weren't acknowledging that they were doing anything for us. And this was all really suspicious. It didn't make sense to us. Our only response that we could do was you have to, as a union member, you can't use the courts. You have to use the BC Labour Board. We have filed complaints with the BC Labour Board against our union for failure of duty and fair representation. They technically have 90 days to bring our terminations to an arbitration, and we're currently at 14 months.
So they're just not holding up their end of the
bargain. They just ignored us. And so we couldn't understand that until then, when this Bill 36 came out, which is the new Healthcare and Occupations Professions Act that Adrian Dix introduced into our BC government. That was just passed November 24th, very quickly. It's a 643 clause bill that deals with anybody who practices as a healthcare professional in BC. And the legislature did not even get to discussing even half of the clauses that were involved in this law. Usually, you know, when you have MPs that are put into position of making laws, it is their job to, you have your first, second, and third reading. So you go through the document, everybody gets to discuss if there's any issues or challenges or questions about it. Then there's revisions made, you go back for a second reading. You do this process so that you can actually create something that has had any issues dealt with it. Well, this particular time, the NDP government didn't even get through a third of the bill and passed it. And as well, gave themselves an extra week of Christmas vacation instead of actually
seems to be a trend here in Canada. It doesn't matter where you are. This like rushing bills through, getting them passed before anybody gets to read it seems to be a real trend throughout our country in the moment, actually right now. And it seems like they're forcing a lot of things, like Bill 36 here in British Columbia. You got the Bill C11, Bill C18 in the federal government. There's a lot of things happening when it comes to stifling free speech. Big power grabs here in the medical system here in British Columbia. And like I said in the intro, if you think it's not happening in your province, you're mistaken. It's coming. There's always a test case, right? And British Columbia, it seems to be the thing. Now, when it comes to these unions, I understand that they don't have to disclose things because they're tax exempt. They're a non-profit entity. But it seems like they're using that as a ploy to be able to, it's what feels like, have them be in bed with the government. And listening to some of your videos and you explaining this, it almost sounds like the Union Party, the NDP in Canada, always known as the Union Party. It feels like they're union busting. They're involved in a union busting operation against the nurses in British Columbia in the medical system.
Well, there's some interesting dynamics here, and I don't know yet what the root of it is. What I have learned, and which was surprising to me, we asked for a copy of the financial statements of the union, and so we obtained copies from 2017 up until 2021. The front page, so these are all statements that are put together by accounting firms. KPMG is the one that the union uses. But the very front page of these financial statements states right on it that this is what's called a qualified opinion. And the definition of a qualified opinion, and they state on the record, is that they have not verified any of the numbers associated with the revenue. And as a result, they cannot confirm that any of the other calculations are correct. So basically, they're saying, we've taken the numbers the union has given us and we have not verified any of them, but we've made these statements for you. Now, in looking through these statements, we came across a few discrepancies. So for instance, in an income statement, when you have a year end, you're going to have amounts that are listed in expenses and revenue. And those numbers at the year end should carry over to the beginning of the next year. But we were finding mistakes like those numbers weren't matching, which is like, that's not cool.
Yeah, no, you'd never get away with that with like Revenue Canada with your taxes or something like that.
Well, and as well, unions, because like you said, they're nonprofit, they don't have to file taxes. So the actual requirements of filing their financial disclosure is less than what you have to do as an individual. You have to produce your T4s, you have to produce whatever you use for expenses, then you have to declare your income. Unions don't have to do that. And so then we were discovering that there was this fund that had been set aside, and in their policy, it was called a defense fund. It's supposed to be used for bargaining and labor relations and stuff.
Right, for exactly what you're going through.
Yeah. And they're only required to have $25 million in that fund. But we discovered that they actually have $60 million in this fund. And so we asked why. What are you using this money for? Because the last time any withdrawals were taken out of it was 2006. So as a nonprofit, this means you cannot show a profit. So how do you explain that you have an account that has $60 million in it that's not a profit? And why aren't you using this to defend your nurses that are, actually we have nurses now that are on welfare and are losing their homes because they can't work here. So we have this issue where, and what's interesting is we actually were able to come up with quite an interesting report going through these financial statements. And we took them to a couple of accounting firms. And this is what I found interesting. We were trying to do an investigation with a forensic accountant. And the first accounting firm that we approached, the accountant was like, oh yeah, I've taken down unions before. I'm familiar with this. Yes, let me add it. And then within a day, we get a response. Hey, sorry, my company, the hierarchy said I can't do it. She was nice enough to give us a contact. And so we went to the second accounting firm. Now, this accounting firm, actually, they weren't sure if they could do it or not, because back in 2007, one of the employees of the executive of the BC Nurses Union embezzled the union for $700,000, and this accounting firm didn't catch it. So they weren't sure if they were going to be considered a conflict of interest.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, they said, yeah, like, we're super interested. We had this meeting. Everything was getting lined up. And then they came back and said, their hierarchy said, we can't do it.
It sounds like a Mafia shakedown. It sounds like...
I would say it's starting to sound a little suspicious, isn't it?
Yeah.
So here we are. We're challenging the fact that our union actually isn't doing its job. There are thousands of grievances sitting on their desk that they are not processing. They have over 200 employees in that union, and none of us know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They are paying themselves quite well with our fees, but we're actually not seeing any work done. And then we have this issue with the whole financial disclosure part, where we can't even see what money is actually being siphoned and directed towards representing nurses versus going out in donations to other people. We don't even have the right to see what this union is doing with this money, and they're running assets of $565 million. Now, what I've also found out in discussions with other unions is that there are similar things happening with other union members, like the public service, BC Ferries. Many people got terminated, and only some have been brought back. So we have an issue where now what we're seeing is that the concept of union, which was, we're like, is there actually any point to keeping a union functioning, right?
Well, yeah.
But
and it's getting back to, what I was saying in the first place. The whole point of them is to help you with your employment, to make sure that any grievances would be filed, and you have a group of employees that will all stand behind you in the case that something unfair happens to you. But here we are in a situation where unfair things are happening to you, and, well, the unions are definitely not standing up. So in the interest of not going too long in this, and I'd love to have you back to explain this. It sounds like there's way more to this than meets the eye. Absolutely. Where do we stand right now, and what kind of battle do we have moving forward?
I'm going to say that I think the best thing that all of us can do now is start to actually expose the lack of enforcement of the protections that we are supposed to be experiencing in this province. I would say I would compare this to the World Cup soccer game, and you've got two teams playing, and both all the referees decided to go have a coffee. There's nobody in this province enforcing the rules that are here to protect us. And I did not, the mistake they made was when they terminated so many of us and the unions did not step up to protect us. They played their hand. They showed what's actually behind the closed doors of those institutions. So now we have a problem with things being a facade. How do we navigate this? I only see one route left, because I'm not seeing that any of those mechanisms that are actually in place to do their jobs, they're not functioning. And I think a lot of that probably is related to that we as a society and as humanity have not really valued something called a moral code or integrity. We've been, to be honest, I was guilty of that. I wasn't paying attention. I was just making money, going on trips, enjoying my life, and was not participating in the actual construct and the building of what we wanted our society to look like. And because this has been gone unnoticed for too long, now the lid of the septic tank has come off, and we've hit the gagging stage a bit. I honestly only see one route, and it's a long-term plan, and that is we need to start identifying people that have integrity, that are smart, that we can identify as leaders, and we are going to have to start infiltrating back into government and positions of leadership. It's a long-term plan. I don't see any other solution. I don't know if you're aware, but they've just started a recall petition. I went through today for David Eby to try to recall him out of his riding. I don't know if they'll be successful, but I'm looking at, what, we just want to be able to communicate. We're definitely not happy with how this government is making decisions and imposing things on us and making life very difficult in terms of how expensive it is to live while it's taking away our jobs. And there has to be a shift in how we as humans are going to start taking ownership of what we want our lives to look like.
Corinne Mori, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure.
And it's my pleasure to bring this story to people in the country, because I really think that people need to hear this. And I want to thank all of you for joining us in this conversation today, and just hearing the story of what's happening to nurses in British Columbia. There are probably similar stories happening all over this nation, and these are the stories that need to be heard. Thank you so much.